The morning Sarah Martinez found the eviction notice nailed to her weathered oak door, she knew her grandfather's warnings about trusting city folk had finally come true. Her calloused fingers trembled as she read the legal document: 30 days to vacate the 200-acre ranch that had been in her family for 4 generations. Eminent domain, she whispered to her loyal German shepherd, Rex, who whined softly at her distress. The words tasted bitter in her mouth, like the coffee she'd forgotten to sweeten that morning. Behind the legal jargon, the truth was crystal clear. Meridian Development Corporation won her land for a luxury shopping complex, and they convinced the county commissioners that her small cattle operation was standing in the way of economic progress. The compensation they offered was laughably low, barely enough to buy a decent trailer, let alone start over somewhere else. Sarah's boots echoed against the porch floorboards as she paced, her mind racing through 3 decades of memories. This was where she'd learned to ride horses, where she buried her beloved grandfather just 2 years ago, where she'd scraped together a living raising organic beef cattle while the world around her transformed into strip malls and subdivisions. The ranch wasn't just her home, it was her identity. Every fence post she mended, every calf she delivered during brutal winter storms, every sunrise she watched from her kitchen window while sipping coffee represented a piece of her soul. They might as well be asking her to tear out her own heart. But Sarah Martinez wasn't the type to go down without a fight. By noon, she was at Hank's Hardware in town, loading rolls of high-tensile wire, insulators, and warning signs into her pickup truck. Old Hank raised an eyebrow as she added a powerful electric fence charger to her purchase. Planning to keep something in or keep something out? He asked with a knowing smile. Both, Sarah replied grimly. She'd grown up hearing stories about her great-grandfather Miguel, who defended this land during the Depression when the bank tried to foreclose. He built barricades and refused to leave until they agreed to restructure his loan. The Martinez family had a proud tradition of standing their ground. That evening, as purple shadows stretched across the pasture, Sarah began stringing the electrified wire around the entire perimeter of her property. Rex trotted alongside her, occasionally barking at jackrabbits that bounded through the sagebrush. The work was backbreaking, but each post she secured felt like a small victory. She paused at the main gate, where a faded wooden sign read Martinez Ranch, established 1952. Her grandfather had carved those letters himself when he was just 25 years old, full of dreams about building something lasting for his family. As she installed the final warning sign, DANGER, Electrified FENC, Sarah felt a mixture of determination and uncertainty settle in her chest. She knew she was about to make powerful enemies. Meridian Development had deep pockets and political connections she could only dream of. But they'd underestimated one crucial factor. They were dealing with a 4th-generation rancher who'd rather die on her land than surrender it to developers who saw dollar signs where she saw heritage. The battle for Martinez Ranch was about to begin, and Sarah intended to send a message that would shock more than just anyone foolish enough to touch her fence. 3 days after Sarah completed her electrified perimeter, they came like vultures to a carcass. She spotted the convoy from her kitchen window, 2 black SUVs followed by a white pickup truck with Meridian Development emblazoned on its doors. Her coffee mug trembled in her hands as she watched them park just outside her newly electrified gate. Rex's hackles rose as he positioned himself beside Sarah on the porch, a low growl rumbling in his throat. 4 men in expensive suits climbed out of the vehicles, their polished shoes clearly unsuited for ranch terrain. The 5th man, wearing coveralls and carrying a clipboard, was obviously her hired surveyor. Miss Martinez called out the tallest of the suited men, his voice carrying an artificial friendliness that made Sarah's skin crawl. "I'm Richard Blackwood, project manager for Meridian Development. We need to discuss your situation." Sarah remained on her porch, arms crossed. "My situation is that you're trespassing. This is private property, and that gate is locked for a reason." Blackwood's smile faltered slightly as he noticed the yellow warning signs. "Now, Miss Martinez, let's be reasonable. The county has already approved our development project. We're simply here to conduct preliminary surveys, as is our legal right under the eminent domain proceedings." "Your legal right ends at my property line," Sarah replied firmly. "You want on my land, you get a court order." The surveyor, a wiry man named Pete, according to his name tag, stepped forward with bolt cutters. "Look, lady, we don't want any trouble. We just need to measure some boundary markers and soil samples. This'll only take an hour." Sarah's voice turned deadly quiet. "I wouldn't touch that fence if I were you, Pete." But Pete was already reaching for the gate latch, ignoring the warning signs completely. The moment his fingers made contact with the metal, a sharp crack split the morning air. Pete let out a yelp that could be heard 3 counties over, jumping backwards so violently he landed on his backside in the dirt. "Son of a..." Pete scrambled away from the fence, shaking his tingling hand. "That thing's electrified." "The signs weren't just for decoration," Sarah called out dryly. Blackwood's face flushed red with anger. This is outrageous. You can't just electrify your property to keep out authorized personnel. Watch me, Sarah replied. That fence is perfectly legal. It's designed to contain livestock and protect my property from unwanted pests. The second suit, a younger man with nervous energy, pulled out his phone. Sir, maybe we should call the sheriff. This could be considered assault. Assault? Sarah laughed. That fence is clearly marked with warning signs every 50 feet. If someone chooses to ignore them, that's their own poor judgment, not my problem. Pete was still shaking his hand, glaring at Sarah with undisguised hatred. You crazy woman. That hurt like hell. Good, Sarah said simply. It's working exactly as intended. Blackwood began pacing back and forth in front of the gate like a caged animal. Miss Martinez, you're only delaying the inevitable. We have legal authority here. This little stunt of yours won't change anything. Maybe not, Sarah admitted, but it sure makes me feel better. And it'll give anyone else second thoughts about wandering onto my property uninvited. The third suit, who'd been quietly taking photos of the fence setup, spoke up. We could bring in insulated equipment, cut the power source. Sarah's smile turned predatory. You could try, but that would be destruction of private property. I have security cameras recording everything. Plus, Rex here doesn't much like strangers, especially ones messing with our fence. As if on cue, Rex let out a deep, menacing bark that made all 5 men take an instinctive step backward. After 20 minutes of frustrated arguing and threats, the Meridian team finally climbed back into their vehicles. But Blackwood rolled down his window for one final warning. This isn't over, Martinez. We'll be back with proper equipment and legal backing. Your little electric fence won't stop progress. Sarah watched the convoy disappear down the dirt road, dust clouds marking their retreat. She scratched Rex behind the ears and smiled with grim satisfaction. Round 1 goes to us, boys, she murmured, but something tells me they're just getting started. That evening, she reinforced her fence with additional warning signs and installed motion-activated floodlights around the perimeter. If Meridian Development wanted a war, Sarah Martinez was ready to give them one they'd never forget. Sheriff Tom Bradley had known Sarah Martinez since she was knee-high to a grasshopper, which made the phone call from Meridian Development all the more uncomfortable. He pulled up to her ranch at dawn, his patrol car crunching over the gravel driveway as Sarah emerged from her barn with a bucket of feed. Morning, Sarah, he called out, tipping his hat. Afraid this isn't a social call. Sarah set down the bucket and wiped her hands on her jeans. Let me guess. Meridian's been crying to you about my fence. Tom nodded reluctantly. They're claiming you assaulted their surveyor with a booby trap. Want to file charges. Booby trap? Sarah's voice rose incredulously. Tom, that fence has warning signs every 50 feet. It's a standard livestock electric fence, same as half the ranchers in this county use. Since when is protecting your property with clearly marked barriers considered assault? The sheriff scratched his graying beard. Well, that's what I told them. Looked up the ordinances myself. Your fence is perfectly legal as long as it's properly marked, which it is. He paused, studying her face. But Sarah, they're not going to give up. These development folks have deeper pockets than the Grand Canyon. As if summoned by their conversation, 2 vehicles approached from the main road. The first was a sleek sedan carrying what appeared to be lawyers, judging by their identical black suits and briefcases. The second was a news van from Channel 7, complete with satellite dish and camera crew. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Did you call the media, Tom? Wasn't me, he replied, but his slight smile suggested he wasn't entirely displeased by the development. The lead lawyer, a sharp-featured woman with silver hair, approached the fence line but stayed well clear of the electrified wire. Miss Martinez, I'm Victoria Sterling, legal counsel for Meridian Development. We need to discuss your illegal obstruction of a lawful development project. Behind her, the news crew was setting up their equipment while reporter Jessica Chen checked her microphone. Sarah had seen Jessica's work before. She was known for her hard-hitting investigations into corporate corruption and local government scandals. There's nothing illegal about my fence, counselor, Sarah replied loudly enough for the cameras to pick up. This is my family's land, and I have every right to protect it. Sterling's voice took on a condescending tone. Miss Martinez, eminent domain proceedings have already begun. Your resistance is merely prolonging the inevitable and costing taxpayers money. That's when Jessica Chen stepped forward with her microphone. Miss Martinez, can you tell our viewers why you're fighting this development? Sarah looked directly into the camera, her voice steady and clear. This ranch has been in my family for 4 generations. My great-grandfather built it from nothing during the Depression. My grandfather expanded it through the Dust Bowl years. My father modernized it, and I've spent 30 years maintaining it as one of the few remaining working ranches in this county. She gestured toward the pasture where her cattle grazed peacefully. Meridian Development wants to tear down all of this history, displace my livestock, and build another shopping mall. They're offering compensation that wouldn't even cover the cost of relocating my animals, let alone finding comparable land. Jessica turned to Sterling. What's Meridian's response to accusations that the compensation is inadequate? Sterling's composure slipped slightly. The compensation is fair market value as determined by independent appraisers. Miss Martinez is simply being unreasonable. Unreasonable. Sarah's voice carried clearly across the ranch. They want to pay me less than half what this land is worth, destroy 4 generations of family heritage, and eliminate one of the last working cattle operations in the area. How is protecting that unreasonable? Sheriff Bradley had been quietly watching the exchange, but now he stepped forward. Ma'am, he addressed Sterling, I've reviewed the county ordinances, and Miss Martinez's fence is completely legal. It's properly marked and designed for livestock containment, which is its primary purpose. Sterling's jaw tightened. Sheriff will be filing for an injunction to have that fence removed as a public safety hazard. You're welcome to try, Tom replied evenly, but you'll need to prove it's actually hazardous, which will be difficult considering it meets all safety requirements. The news segment aired that evening, and by the next morning, Sarah's phone was ringing constantly. Ranchers from across 3 counties called to offer support. Environmental groups reached out about preserving agricultural land. Even some city folks who were tired of endless development expressed solidarity. More importantly, the story caught the attention of Margaret Chen, Jessica's retired mother, who happened to be a retired judge with expertise in eminent domain law. She arrived at Sarah's ranch the following afternoon in a dusty Honda Civic, carrying a briefcase full of legal precedents. Miss Martinez, Margaret said, extending a weathered hand, I've been fighting eminent domain abuse for 40 years. Your case has some interesting angles that Meridian's lawyers might not have considered. They spent hours reviewing the legal documents in Sarah's kitchen while Rex dozed at their feet. Margaret pointed out several procedural irregularities in the county's approval process and questionable connections between Meridian's investors and local commissioners. The compensation offer is clearly inadequate, Margaret explained, but more importantly, they haven't proven that this development serves a compelling public interest. A luxury shopping center isn't the same as a hospital or highway. By week's end, Margaret had filed a countersuit challenging the eminent domain proceedings on multiple grounds. She also discovered that Meridian had made similar lowball offers to 3 other longtime ranching families in the area, suggesting a pattern of exploitation. The legal battle was just beginning, but Sarah no longer felt like she was fighting alone. Every morning, she checked her fence and smiled at the warning signs that had become symbols of resistance. Meridian Development had expected an easy victory over a single rancher. Instead, they'd awakened a community and attracted the attention of people who understood that some things, like family heritage and agricultural tradition, were worth more than the highest bid. The confrontation that would change everything happened on a Tuesday morning when Sarah was checking her cattle in the far pasture. She heard the rumble of engines and Rex's urgent barking long before she saw the convoy approaching her ranch. This time, Meridian Development had brought more than lawyers and surveyors. 3 utility trucks, 2 security vehicles, and a sleek black Escalade formed an impressive intimidation parade along her fence line. Sarah grabbed her binoculars and cursed under her breath. They brought professional equipment, insulated gloves, rubber mats, and what looked like industrial wire cutters. But it was the man stepping out of the Escalade who made her blood run cold. Even from a distance, she recognized William Meridian himself, the billionaire founder of Meridian Development Corporation. Silver-haired, expensively dressed, and radiating the arrogance that came with decades of getting his way through money and power. Sarah sprinted toward her house, pulling out her phone to call Margaret Chen. "They're here with cutting equipment," she said breathlessly. And Meridian himself showed up. "Don't engage directly," Margaret warned. "Let them make the first move and document everything." But Sarah was already grabbing her camera and heading for the confrontation. Rex bounded alongside her, sensing the tension in the air. By the time she reached the fence line, the utility workers were already setting up their equipment while Meridian gestured impatiently. He was clearly not accustomed to being kept waiting by anyone, let alone a small-town rancher. "Miss Martinez," Meridian called out, his voice carrying the artificial charm of a practiced dealmaker. "I'm William Meridian. I think it's time we had a reasonable conversation about this unfortunate situation." Sarah positioned herself on her side of the fence, camera ready. "Mr. Meridian, this is private property. Your workers are preparing to commit criminal destruction of property." Meridian's smile tightened. "Miss Martinez, I've built shopping centers from Seattle to Miami. I've dealt with countless property owners who initially resisted progress. They all eventually saw reason." "Maybe they didn't have anything worth fighting for," Sarah replied. "This land means something." "Everything has a price," Meridian said dismissively. He pulled out a checkbook. "I'm prepared to offer you triple the county's appraisal value. Right here, right now. You could be off this property by month's end with enough money to buy a nice condo in town. Sarah's jaw tightened. My family's legacy isn't for sale at any price. Meridian's facade of politeness finally cracked. Your family's legacy? This is a dying ranch on prime commercial real estate. You're standing in the way of a development that will create hundreds of jobs and millions in tax revenue. By destroying the last working ranch in the county, Sarah shot back. By turning farmland into another concrete wasteland where people shop for things they don't need with money they don't have. The billionaire's face flushed red. You're being ridiculous. This is business, not sentiment. He turned to his head of security. Cut through this fence. We're done wasting time. Sarah raised her camera as the security chief approached the gate with industrial cutters. I'm documenting everything for the lawsuit, she announced loudly. But Meridian had clearly reached his limit with what he saw as small-town stubbornness. I'll cut it myself, he snapped, snatching the wire cutters from his employee. This is absurd. I've acquired properties worth hundreds of millions. I'm not going to be stopped by some farmer's electric fence. Mr. Meridian, I wouldn't. His security chief started to warn, but the billionaire was already approaching the gate. Sarah watched in fascination as one of the most powerful men in real estate development completely ignored the bright yellow warning signs that littered her fence. His arrogance had blinded him to the obvious danger. Sir, those signs. Another employee called out, but Meridian waved him off dismissively. It's just scare tactics, he said confidently, reaching for the metal gate latch with his bare hand. The crack of electricity was so loud it echoed across the entire ranch. Meridian's body convulsed as several thousand volts coursed through him, the wire cutters flying from his grip as he let out a yell that could be heard in the next county. He stumbled backward, tripped over his own feet, and landed hard in a patch of mud left by the previous night's rain. For a moment, the only sound was Rex's excited barking and the hum of the electric fence charger. Then Meridian's employees rushed to help their mud-covered, electrically shocked boss to his feet. You, Meridian sputtered, his silver hair now resembling a mad scientist's after his clothing and dignity had both been thoroughly compromised. You tried to kill me. The fence is clearly marked with warning signs, Sarah replied calmly, still recording. Multiple signs that say, danger, electrified, fet and C. I'd say it worked exactly as advertised. Meridian's face was purple with rage and embarrassment. This is assault. I'll have you arrested. I'll sue you for everything you own. Good luck with that, Sarah said. You just committed attempted destruction of private property while ignoring multiple safety warnings. On camera, the billionaire's security chief was frantically trying to clean mud off his boss's expensive suit while Meridian continued to rant about lawsuits and arrests. But Sarah noticed something interesting in the man's eyes that hadn't been there before: uncertainty. For the first time in probably decades, William Meridian had encountered something that couldn't be bought, intimidated, or bulldozed. The electric fence hadn't just shocked his body, it had shocked his assumption that money and power could overcome any obstacle. As the convoy retreated for the second time, leaving tire tracks in the mud and Meridian's dignity scattered across the ranch, Sarah scratched Rex behind the ears and smiled. I think we just sent the loudest message yet, boy, she murmured, watching the Escalade disappear down the road. And something tells me the whole town's going to hear about this before supper time. Someone at Meridian Development had leaked the security footage of their boss's electrifying encounter with Sarah's fence, and by evening, Billionaire vs. Electric Fence was trending on social media across the 3 states. The sight of William Meridian, mud-covered and dignity stripped, became an instant symbol of corporate arrogance meeting small-town resistance. Sarah discovered her newfound internet fame when her neighbor's teenage daughter showed her the video on her phone. Miss Martinez, you're like totally famous. Look at all these comments supporting you. Indeed, the comment sections were overwhelmingly in Sarah's favor. Ranchers, farmers, and ordinary citizens who'd felt bulldozed by corporate development shared their own stories. Environmental groups rallied around preserving agricultural land. Even urban dwellers who'd never seen a cow expressed support for the underdog rancher who literally shocked a billionaire back to reality. But the real game-changer came 3 days later when Margaret Chen called with news that made Sarah drop her coffee mug. Sarah, you need to sit down for this, Margaret said, barely containing her excitement. Our investigation into Meridian's finances just hit the jackpot. It turned out that William Meridian's shock had been more than just physical. The humiliating incident had triggered a cascade of scrutiny that uncovered some very uncomfortable truths about Meridian Development's business practices. A whistleblower from within the company, emboldened by seeing their invincible boss faceplant in the mud, had come forward with evidence of bribes paid to county commissioners and fraudulent environmental impact reports. The FBI is opening a federal investigation, Margaret explained. Meridian's stock price has dropped 30% in 2 days. Three of their major investors are pulling out, and the county commissioners who approved the eminent domain are facing corruption charges. Sarah stared out her kitchen window at the cattle grazing peacefully in her pasture, hardly believing what she was hearing. The final domino fell a week later when William Meridian himself requested a private meeting at Sarah's ranch. This time, he came alone, driving a modest rental car instead of his usual convoy. His expensive suit had been replaced with jeans and a polo shirt, and his previous arrogance had been thoroughly deflated. Sarah met him at the gate, the same electrified gate that had delivered his comeuppance. This time, he stayed well clear of the wire. "Miss Martinez," he began, his voice lacking its previous commanding tone, "I owe you an apology." Sarah crossed her arms but remained silent, letting him continue. "I spent 40 years bulldozing my way through obstacles, treating people and places like line items on a balance sheet," Meridian said, staring at the ground. That shock, both literally and figuratively, made me realize I'd lost sight of what actually matters. He looked up at her ranch, taking in the well-maintained buildings, the healthy cattle, and the obvious care that went into every detail. "This isn't just land, is it? It's a home, a legacy, something money can't replace." "No, it can't," Sarah agreed simply. Meridian reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. "I'm withdrawing from the development project entirely. These are the papers transferring ownership of the adjacent 500 acres back to you. Land that's been in your family for generations, but that we'd already purchased from previous owners. Consider it compensation for my behavior." Sarah's eyes widened. The adjacent land had been her grandfather's, originally sold decades ago during a financial crisis. She dreamed of buying it back someday, but never imagined it was possible. "There's one condition," Meridian continued. "I want to fund a conservation easement on the entire property. It'll ensure this ranch can never be developed, preserving it for future generations of your family." 2 months later, Sarah stood on her porch watching the sunrise paint the sky pink and gold over her expanded ranch. The electrified fence was still there, though it no longer needed to keep out corporate invaders. Now it served its original purpose, keeping her cattle safe and secure on land that would remain in her family forever. Rex bounded up from the pasture, tail wagging, followed closely by the newest addition to the ranch, a rescued horse named Lightning that Sarah had adopted with part of the settlement money. The irony of the name wasn't lost on her. Her phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Chen. "Jessica's doing a follow-up story on ranching preservation. Interested in being featured?" Sarah smiled and typed back, "Absolutely. The story deserves to be told." The Martinez Ranch had become more than just a family legacy. It had become a symbol of what was possible when ordinary people refused to back down from corporate bullies. The electrified fence that had started as a desperate defensive measure had evolved into something much more powerful. A reminder that some victories require nothing more than standing your ground and refusing to give up. As Sarah walked out to check on her cattle, she paused at the gate where her grandfather's carved sign still hung. Martinez Ranch, established 1952. Below it, she added a smaller sign that had become something of a local landmark. Home of the fence that shocked a billionaire. Visitors came by regularly now, other ranchers facing development pressure, journalists documenting rural preservation efforts, and even tourists wanting to see the famous electric fence. Sarah welcomed them all, sharing her story and encouraging others to fight for what they believed in. The ranch was thriving, the land was protected forever, and Sarah Martinez had proved that sometimes the best defense against corporate greed wasn't lawyers or politicians or money. Sometimes it was just a well-marked electric fence and the courage to flip the switch. Every morning when she walked past that fence, Sarah remembered her grandfather's words, "Stand your ground, Major. This land is worth fighting for." She'd stood her ground, all right, and the shockwave from that decision was still rippling outward, inspiring others to defend their own piece of the American dream, one electrified fence post at a time.